Okay, we should be live. YouTube people, let us know if you cannot hear us. Well, you can't hear me. So anyway, all core devs, consensus layer call 127. This is issue 951 PM repo. There is the link. We have quite a bit to talk about. I have a feeling that we're going to have to, again, keep continuing this conversation over the next couple of calls, but hopefully we can make some good progress today. Generally on the agenda, we're going to go over Deneb, anything we must discuss, as well as some discussion around mainnet scheduling. There was what I would call pretty minor incident on mainnet, but one that might have significant things to talk about. So I don't know if there's a post-mortem out, but I do want to just give us room to talk about that in the event that there are critical things to discuss now. I'd like to keep that relatively independent of the discussion of EPBS, which would come a bit later. Then we'll talk about Electra again. Maybe we're settling on a joint name and have already, but let's talk about that briefly. EIP 7549, which has been agreed to be included, has a bit, just some, I think, minor design considerations that we want to escalate. Then the conversation around various things that may or may not go in the continued conversation, then open discussion. All right, let's go ahead and get started. On Deneb, I believe we have forked another public testnet. Is there a general status update or any thing that we want to discuss in related to testnets and testing?
Yeah, so we had the Holsky fork yesterday, and since the fork went well, we barely lost any participation rate, and it looks like we were getting blobs from quite early on. Besides that, there's been nothing we've noticed, at least on Holsky. And we've passed the blob expiry window for Gurley. So we ran a bunch of nodes and are doing a mixture of Genesis sync as well as checkpoint sync. And all the checkpoint sync nodes, EL and CL, other than the archive ones, have already synced ahead. And the archive ones, we should have information within another day or so.
Terrence?
Notice that I'm not sure if anyone is watching, but the slot 0 where the fork transaction block, it's actually missed, so someone didn't send that block. And then the slot 1 was arrived, but it was arrived at my local node. It was 11 seconds later. So like honestly, this is probably not a big deal, but like as the client team, it's probably worth checking whether this is your implementation that's causing the delay. We are also checking the background to make sure Prism Validator is okay under those scenarios. Because I suspect maybe the fork translation may take like more than a few seconds here. So yeah.
This is on Holesky?
Yeah, this is on Holesky.
Got it. Any further comment or discussion on that point? Specifically Terrence's. Okay. When I'm curious, when you're syncing from Genesis past the prune window, do you have to bring in a piece of mainnet information that is within the prune window, or can you do so trustlessly?
Right now, we're struggling to sync Genesis and Gurley to begin with, because I'm not sure there's that many Gurley archive nodes. Okay. So irrespective of block expired. And the checkpoint sync nodes, they work fine.
Very cool. Any other discussion points for Deneb, Dankun in relation to testing testnets? Sean?
So we discussed this a few months ago, but in a scenario where the chain hasn't finalized for the data availability period, the way to recover would be to checkpoint sync from an unfinalized checkpoint.
Right.
And also that generally just be useful for like some sort of social recovery in a long period of non-finalization. So
So by
we have,
recover, you mean be able to sync during that environment. You could still follow the head in that environment.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
okay.
So we've been working on like enabling this in Lighthouse, and it was actually kind of tricky because we look at like peers, their finalized epoch and compare it to our own, and we treat this as sort of like a virtual finalization. So we would just assume we were ahead of all our peers and it would stall our sync on our nodes. So I would just encourage other client teams to also look into this because it was the type of thing that we thought should work until we really dug into it.
Right. So in the event of issue, don't just assume this is easy. You know, if we run into something in mainnet. Is there any further comment or any more color on why this was difficult?
For us specifically, it was because of peering. Like we treat the unfinalized checkpoint as finalized, and this is good internally in that like you're sure to never reorg and whatnot.
Right.
But your view of the chain, I guess, your view of like which peers are useful, that was the specific issue. Yeah.
I see. Do you end up reading finalized information from that state and using that for your peering information, or was there a different trick?
No, we're using the essentially like the unfinalized checkpoint, and we assume that our node is actually further ahead in sync because we're comparing that to other chains' actual finalized checkpoint, which in this scenario would always be lower. So we end up sorting through all our peers and saying that they're all useless.
Yeah. What I'm saying is the workaround to then use the finalized information that's actually written in the checkpoint state, not the checkpoint state itself.
Oh, so now what we're doing is we're making sure that like Lighthouse is aware of if it's in this particular mode, so it's aware of whether it was started up with a non-finalized checkpoint, and when it's comparing itself to peers, it'll take this into account and instead look at like the head of the peer chains.
Okay. Otis, did you have a comment?
Oh no, I'll ask in the chat. It's technical.
Yeah. Okay. All right, thanks, Sean. Anything else on this one?
That's about it, but if anyone runs into similar issues, feel free to reach out.
Cool. Other Deneb Dankun testing items. Marston?
Yeah, right now I'm spamming Girly network with block transactions. As far no issues, but it's like 1/3 of experiment. So if there will be some issues, we'll see it in a few minutes, maybe half an hour from now. But yeah, as far everything looks fine.
Great. Thank you. Any other Dankun testing related items? Okay, great work. I believe as has been broadly discussed over the past handful of calls and much more concretely discussed on the last ACDE, there's an intention to talk about and pick a mainnet date. Tim?
Yes. So yeah, my feeling is on the EL side, teams are generally pretty ready to both pick a date and then start putting out releases for it. I think there's not too much strong opinions about what the date should be, and like obviously getting CL folks' perspectives on that is valuable. And yeah, I mean, if I can share my screen, I have a bunch of potential dates like the next month-ish. So assuming that teams, you know, are ready to put out a release in the next week or so, I think these all make sense. Generally, we probably want like 2-3 weeks between the announcement for mainnet and then the actual fork. So we should pick a date that like, yeah, teams, like we should figure out when teams are all comfortable having a release, and then pick a date that's a couple weeks after that. And then, yeah, all the times on this sheet, I'll put this in the chat, but all of these are like the epoch history accumulator boundaries. And they're all sort of midweek, so between Tuesday and Thursday. So yeah, curious to hear from client teams if they have any preference on, or maybe, yeah, it makes sense to hear from client teams like when they could have like a mainnet release out, and then based on that, maybe we can pick a date. Yeah.
So maybe a bit more concrete, Tim, when speaking with execution layer teams, is
I think
everyone
we could have
game,
releases out next week. Yeah.
meaning by Friday of next week, by
Sometime next week. So I think like the earliest that from the EL side we could fork would be the 27th, 28th, which would feel, yeah, so okay. So Maris is saying they can get one out this week. So like, I think, yeah, the most aggressive timeline on the EL side is really like the last week of February. And Terrence has a question in the chat. So hearing about L2 testing. So I reached out to all the teams that were in like the top 10-ish on L2 beats this week. I think pretty much all of them got back to me, but no one had any major issues. All the teams are pretty much in testing phases at various stages. I think teams are like will be ready on the L2 side to use 4844 on mainnet around early to mid-March. Yeah, so that's basically where things where things are at from L2. So I don't think we should block anything based on where L2 teams are at. And I think from the EL side, we can have people start releasing this week, and then potentially the releases coming out next week for the other teams, and be ready at the earliest end of February.
real quick, your doc does not have open access.
Yeah, I
there
just
was a
changed the
screenshot
link.
shared. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I'll post an actual screenshot in the chat too.
I think it's interested. Terrence.
Yeah, so from Prism side, we surveyed the question internally on when we will be ready to do this major release. So we still like 2 weeks because we still have to do some general cleanup and we want to test block field further. So I don't think we'll be ready to cut our release next week.
But would be by Wednesday, Thursday of the following.
Most likely, yes. 2 weeks will, yes, 2 weeks will be better.
Any other perspective input on where you stand on where consensus layer teams stand on being able to release?
I think for Lighthouse, probably same sort of timeline, like Wednesday, Thursday, the week after next.
Okay, on the consensus layer, is anybody not able to hit that target? Which would put us at, you know, a mainnet blog post on that Friday of the following week at the latest, if we agreed on that target, which then we'd have to pick a date that puts us in a good time frame from there.
Okay for Taiku.
Yeah, let's start in perspective. Let's start Nimbus.
Yeah, we can meet those timelines. For Lodestar.
Thanks.
So I guess then the two dates that are like most reasonable is either Thursday, March 7th, which would be like a straight 2 weeks after the releases, and or Tuesday, March 12th, which is I don't know, 2 weeks plus like 3-4 days, 2 weeks plus a weekend after the releases. Yeah, I don't know if there's a strong. Okay, so there's a debate in the chat between 7 and 12.
Is there a good reason not to do it as quickly as possible?
I think as long as we have 2 weeks ish from the blog posts, that's like reasonable. Yeah.
What's the shortest we've done on Mainnet before? Tim, do you know?
I think we had one. Yeah, we had one shorter than that, but that was not great.
Okay, what's the shortest we've done when we weren't in an emergency?
Probably on the. I'd have to check. But probably on the order of like, yeah, 2-3 weeks. So we can do, if people feel uncomfortable with that, we can do like the week of March. We can do like the 13th or the 14th, which is like closer to a full 3 weeks. If from the chat, that seems to be the main the main feedback. So the 12th.
Yeah, the 12th was the 12th.
12th is Tuesday. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of the week of the 12th, each have a slot that would work. So we can, if we want to do like closer to like a proper 3 weeks, then some, doing like the 13th or something is like 3 weeks.
Okay. I think given the constraints of consensus layer teams wanting or needing 2 weeks from now, I think it's reasonable to land on 13.
Yeah. Okay.
Like if there's an I'd prefer 12-13 over 14-15, just given the some room on the post side from the weekend.
Middle of the week is nice. And then obviously if client teams can start putting out releases as soon as they're ready today, basically, as long as we have the dates. So, and then we'll have the blog post out in about 2 weeks once we have all the client releases. Okay, so I'll post the information in the chat, but yeah.
And what are we saying the actual like deadline for client releases is?
Okay, absolute latest is this call 2 weeks from now. So like so that's 2 weeks.
Okay.
Got
it. Okay. Any further comment or thoughts on this? Okay. Tim, should we kind of circulate that information? I'll put it out on Discord.
Yes, I'll put it on Discords and open some PRs on the specs repo and tweet about it to make it properly official.
Great. Congratulations. Very exciting. Okay. Like I said, I don't believe there's been a post-mortem on the opposite relay invalid block incident. But I think we know relatively what happened. Is there any do people want to surface details here? 2, is there anything to do today? Obviously, EPBS and other things that might come in the pipeline are very valid and worth discussion, but are there particular tests that need to be added, or security things that need to be layered in, or it really, you know, is there anything to patch today? Okay, is that
Tests? What do you mean by
lengthy?
tests? What do you mean by things that we can do right now?
Yeah, just should the
Yeah, so
surface something in
there's an
Hive, should
immediate
this,
one.
yeah.
There's an immediate one. We can just change our circuit breaker so that if we see invalid blocks, we fall back to local production. We are only doing this on missed blocks, on enough missed blocks in an epoch, but perhaps we can be much more aggressive with invalid blocks.
Is no one circuit breaking as invalid, as though invalid is missed, or just there weren't enough?
We are all circuit breaking on missed blocks, and we are circuit breaking. An invalid block only counts as missed. What I'm saying is that we can add another
that can be a
test that
heightened,
if it's
yeah.
invalid, we just increase the frequency.
Right.
But I mean, that's also like that potentially allows for DOS attacks, right? If you give a high
You
weight
can
to
turn,
invalid
yeah, you
blocks.
can turn off.
What do you mean DOS
You can
attack?
basically turn
Here
mass
you're gonna
boost
fall back
off-
to local
off.
production.
Right, but if you can get all of the quote honest players to fall back to local production with a couple of invalid blocks, then you might be able to dominate the MEV market more easily. So there's certainly a trade-off between those, the ability to turn this thing off, or how easy it is to turn this thing off.
Yeah, you could, Sean just said this, but yeah, if you check the proposer's signature and that it was invalid, those two things would be pretty strong signal. And the only person who could send an invalid block would be like a proposer intentionally.
Oh, that's what I
Like,
mean.
oh,
But if you're
okay.
20% of the network and you can turn it off with 2 blocks for everyone.
Any builder can do it. Any builder
Yeah.
can intentionally just trivially generate it,
Right,
and they just have to be the highest bidder. So like I just have to take whatever number the minimum number of invalid blocks after which we turn off is.
But I still don't see what's really the attack here into making people fall back to local execution. I'd be happy if builders didn't exist even.
Well, but okay, so but I as a pool, for example, let's say I'm a pool having 20% of blocks, and I can disable like mass boost for everyone else by sending 3 invalid blocks. Like the cost of those might be low enough that my 20% blocks that afterwards I get so much MEV out of it that it's worth it for me. So it is an attack on all the other validators who follow this rule.
Yeah. And also you don't have to circuit break yourself, right? Like that pool can still keep using Mev Boost.
Exactly. There's no enforcement for the circuit breaking. It's a local thing. So it's basically a disadvantage for you to have too aggressive circuit breaking. So like irrational people just won't do it.
Yep, agreed.
So usually when we add something like this, though, we make it configurable. So like it'd be hard to specifically like know that you're going to be able to get some proportion of the network offline, or even like certain proposers offline. And it's also, we wouldn't have to agree across clients on like, let's do this after one bad block.
Yeah, then again, you know, defaults are strong, and the more that you send, the more you'd see the network switching their behavior. So yeah, I agree with you, but I also agree that like depending on the level of the attacker, it can still be a profitable avenue, and they can kind of ratchet it up. I guess one question that's worth escalating is obviously a lot of the kind of Mev Boost MEV monitoring tools are extremely aware of builders and relays. You know, they see this information surfaced in block explorers and all sorts of analysis. you could imagine circuit breaking more specifically on actors, but the protocol doesn't know about the actors. So is there actually a reasonable path to circuit break on a particular builder or circuit break on a particular relay? Or is that too kind of heuristic in trying to decide who those players are without a native integration, L1 integration?
Well, you could add some logic to MEP boost. Arguably, everyone is using essentially the same software. And you could add some logic itself to MEP boost to ban particular relays.
Right, but do I know that the relay was bad? If you're interacting with the relay, you probably know it's bad. But if you're interacting with the relay and it gives you something invalid, then do I know? Like, can the entire network know that?
So
I guess like currently we don't have a proof that a particular relay created a block, right? Because just because it goes to that relay's address, someone else could fake that.
It's presumably authentic. Talking with them is authenticated on some level, so you could share that
Right.
as a proof. Yeah.
Yes, right. But we don't currently have that.
Right. Okay.
Also, bids are signed, right? Aren't they signed by builders? Or are they signed by relays?
They're signed by the builder, but the relay verifies it, and that doesn't go on chain. Like that's just from the relay to verify the identity of the builder that sent it.
Right. So we would have to like broadcast bids or something.
Yeah,
you
that's
have
what
to
Francesca's been suggesting.
Shatter these things. Yeah. Like if there were an optional gossip channel, I could drop this information to the network.
Yeah, this kind of sounds like the optimistic V3 version, which we talked about a long time ago. But the idea was like you have a gossip channel for the headers, and you have more observability there. I think the main issue here is that like in terms of latency, the proposers probably won't get their bids from there because it's just a lot slower than directly connecting to the relay builder.
Oh, right.
But,
I'm not saying utilize that channel for selecting the bid. I'm saying I, as the person that interacts with the relay, can drop information about my interaction into such a channel so that people can act upon that. If I see that who you interacted with and I see an invalid block, my local setup could say, oh, I don't want to interact with that entity anymore.
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay, I don't mean to say this group should decide what should happen. I just wanted to kind of go through the exercise of deciding if something can happen that does not require protocol changes, to at least contextualize what people might be able to do soon or talk about in follow-up conversations. Is there anything else that we want to discuss around this incident today?
I guess it's worth mentioning that this was a bug in like the non-buggy version of optimistic relaying would have only resulted in one missed slot. So it's not like the optimistic model allows for this. It was just like there was a bug in the relay end. So I don't see it as like fundamentally changing anything.
And was the relay bonded, and is the relay doing something with respect to that bond?
Right. Yeah. So the builders are bonded with the relay.
Right.
In this case, since it was the relay's fault, they refunded the proposers directly. Ben from BlocksRoute was on this Twitter Spaces yesterday talking about it. So yeah, that's already taken care of in terms of like the restitution, I guess.
Which is kind of one of the attempted things to happen with optimistic relay is to surface, quote, at least via a trust model, unconditional payment.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not really unconditional because you have to trust that the relay will refund you, and I think that's the issue that
Right.
people have with it.
It's trust that they'll refund you, and otherwise the network probably. The assumption is people would then not use that relay anymore. Is the trust?
Yeah, exactly. Like if Bloxroute chose not to refund the like 1 ETH worth of missed slots, then like I think they lose a lot of credibility in terms of the validators connecting to them.
Okay. Anything else here? We will have some discussion around current EPBS designs coming up in the Electra discussion. Okay. Is anyone that works kind of in the MEV-Boost specs, MEV-Boost landscape interested in specking what a gossip channel around proofs of this kind of stuff would work on, or how that would work, or is that not something that people want to dig into right now?
I'd be strongly against it, because if we are going to go with a protocol change that does something like this is already covered in EPBS. This is literally covered in EPBS.
Right. I guess my argument would be, even if we're going to ship EPBS as the next thing in the next fork, we're still talking about 12 months.
I don't think we've made a decision on EPBS though, right? Like, I mean,
Correct.
this depends
We're not.
on
That was a
having-
very
this
conditional.
this depends on actually having a viable construction. So I think, like, I don't think we should presume anything at this point.
I agree. It's just that my point would be that having something that colludes with EPBS, I would much rather discuss EPBS.
All right, and let's discuss it in a couple points.
Why does it pollute it?
It continues to. The band-aids would I think the argument is the band-aids would make it such that MEV-Boost can continue to live another day instead of actually working on kind of the native solution.
No, but that's a terrible argument.
I think the argument is not terrible if you consider complexity analysis. Like if it's 50% as complex just to patch MEV-Boost,
right.
Then do EPBS right, then maybe we're talking about it. If it's 1% of the complexity, then that's a different world. I do want to table this. I do want to talk about a couple things around Electra and then get into the EPBS discussion in a couple of points. Okay. There is a desire to figure out what the joint name of Electra is, Electra and Prague. It seems like some believe it's already been discussed and named as Pectra. I believe I've seen this in testing in a couple of other places. This is the last thing in the world that I want to be trying to use our decision-making power on, but does anybody want to make a case that's not Pectra with a C? Okay. I'm gonna take that as some sort of decision or desire not to talk about this. And we will continue forward. Great. Okay. Based on some discussions with Donkrad that then surfaced into, and others that then surfaced into a comment on 7549, there was a desire to kind of like do 7549 all the way and be able to more unify attestations on chain than keeping the kind of vestigial committee index within a different place of the attestation. It seems like that is generally what some of the designers want to do. But Mikhail, can you give us some more context and some of the trade-offs here?
Yeah, thanks, Danny. So basically, this is the one more step on top of what was originally proposed by 7549. And yeah, as Danny said, it allows to pack attestations more tightly on chain in on-chain structures. And what's nice about it is that considering the current validator set size, we can increase the block space in terms of attestations up to 4 times. So instead of currently we can keep attestations for 2 slots if they're kind of ideally aggregated. This change would allow to do this for 8 slots instead of 2 without increasing the block size in bytes. This is great. Yeah, if attestations were kind of like aggregated really well, this change will allow just to reduce the size of a block. Yeah, keeping the same information, the same number of votes in it. So basically, how to achieve this is turn the aggregation bits into a list of bit lists. So basically, every item of this list will represent the bit list of each committee of the committee. And also the other change we would need to here is to turn committee index into committee bits of the same size, which is 64 bits. Yeah, this is going to be a bit vector, which will have bits of the committees that are included into the aggregation bits list. So basically, it's a quite straightforward change, and we can reuse the same structure for on-chain aggregates, where many committees will be in one attestation. Obviously, signature will be aggregated for all of those committees. Also, it can be used on the network where just one committee will be in the attestation, in this attestation structure, which is kind of required by the network, by the aggregation algorithm that we currently have. Relatively small changes to the spec. We'll have to do some, we'll have to go over all committees when processing the attestation. The dep line made a great point about complexity of tester slashing messages, and this is really one of the kind of complexities here. So it basically this tight aggregation would mean that if we want to create a tester slashing message out of on-chain data, which are tightly packed, it will mean that we'll have to say if there is just a slot, a committee which will have a size of a slot of validators that assigned to a slot. So we'll have to keep all those in one indexes of all those validators in one attester slashing message. There is a bit of analysis linked into the comment. So we'll have an increase there, but if we have like this, this more kind of more of a problem for the attester sessions where slash just one or a couple of validators. They can be much bigger than what we have now, because currently we have a quite good granularity of attestations. But for kind of like mass slashings events, this will not be too bad. We'll probably have to do something at least to reduce the max attester slashings to 1. So you can read about in the comment about this analysis and about the proposed changes that I have gone over really quickly. And
in the proposed changes, you're suggesting reducing the number of on-chain attestations to 8, given that you can handle a lot in these bit lists. Does that reduces the diversity of attestations that can make it on chain? Do you see an issue in the event there's high asynchrony or forking, such that you can only capture kind of 8 different views, or is that, do you think, sufficient?
Yeah, I think yeah, it's a good point. I think it's pretty much sufficient. I don't think it changes the status quo in that regard. I don't see how it differs to what we have today. It might be even better because we increase the capacity of one block, so it can accommodate more votes in it.
Well, it's a trade-off because you increase the capacity, but you decrease the diversity of that capacity, the potential diversity of that capacity, which it seems like is the proper trade-off, is a reasonable trade-off, but one to consider at least. Because you could do another thing, right? You could have like a more sophisticated counter here that you could have 2 counters where you can have many attestations that have a small number of bit lists, or you could have fewer attestations that have a large number of bit lists. But then you're adding certainly more complexity to get that trade-off space between the 2.
Right, but if you have many attestations from different slots, yeah, that can be right. So it can be
right. So kind of how I thought about it before.
Reduce, yeah.
How I thought about it before I read it was like you could have essentially 2 counters, but then certainly more complexity.
Yeah, I think overall, I think this this change requires more deep analysis, and this is basically a temperature check. And yeah, if there is a desire, willingness of client devs to extend this EAP, then we can, invest more time in analyzing trade-offs of this solution. But I think, yeah, this change is what basically, what actually the original proposal was supposed to enable. Yeah, and not doing it, not exploring the space. Yeah, I think it's.
Yeah, I think something in this direction makes a lot of sense if we're going to be cleaning up the committee index. And at least the temperature check on everyone in the PR is good so far. Does anybody have any additional comments? Okay. I would say we should go for the more cleaned up version.
Cool. So I'll do some analysis and try to come up to spec changes. And one other question I had is probably that we can have it as a separate EAP, but we have it in the next hard fork. I don't see it makes sense to have it as a separate EAP, so it can be as an go in this EAP. But yeah, if we consider it for a later inclusion, it could be separate EAP.
Yeah, it seems like the relative complexity is marginal on top of what was already there, so I'd hope not to do it in a 2-step fashion, but open discussion. Okay, great. We're going to continue the conversation around what to include or not include in Electra. I believe 2 weeks ago we did not have our full conversation around SSC, or at least give enough time for discussion. Eitan, is there anything additional you want to bring to this group, or do people have questions for Eitan? Again, noting that a lot of this complexity is on the execution layer, and so I do think that a decision point, certainly the consensus layer can say we don't want to prioritize this, but I think a lot of the decision point on the complexity ends up on the other side of this equation. But nonetheless, SSC.
From my side, I don't think I need to add some more explanations from last week. I went through all of them.
Right.
I think on the consensus side, the stable container one, EIP 7495, may also be useful to have forward compatible generalized index for execution payload, beacon state and beacon block, just because those structures keep changing. And I think if we can make them forward compatible, it would help decentralized staking pools such as Rocket Pool to require fewer engineering to keep up to date with the various forks.
Right, and to remove a piece that that might need to be governed. Engineering is one thing, and then also figuring out if and when and how to deploy a change.
Security review and stuff for sure.
Yeah, what is the temperature check on doing kind of a one-time change on these data structures to make them forward compatible? Forwardly stable.
For SSC library, it's quite easy, by the way. It's not a big deal.
Right. Does adding that kind of one-time break in the structure of the tree, is that a huge engineering complexity? Does anybody want to weigh in on that?
It's only for new blocks though. Like from the fork, you just have a new block type. And the difference is that those blocks you can then use the same parser also for future blocks. And I'm not sure if everyone reviewed this already.
Right. Anybody want to give any signal in one way or the other? I pretty much zero temperature check on this.
Well, it seems like a good thing to have. I haven't personally looked into this, so I don't really know how complicated it is. I know people are generally wary of like new SSD types because like the ones we have are super well tested, but it seems like a good thing to have.
In terms of engineering work, changing fast SSC library is always a pain, but if it's not too large of a change, then I guess we can handle it.
Yeah, Casey's surfacing that he'd rather wait until this was bundled with more SSC changes. Okay, is this something that teams want to do a little bit of diligence on, and we can talk about again in 2 weeks? Okay, I will pop that on the next agenda and pop a message into Discord saying if you want to take a look at this to have a more in-depth conversation, now's the time. Okay, any other SSC discussions? Great, thank you. POTAs, EPBS.
All right, so I don't know how to start this discussion actually. So I think the problem that we've seen on Mainnet is not like a light problem or a minor problem. It's not the issue that 9 blocks were missing or that validators like got refunded or not by a relay. The problem is that we need to trust the relay for this. We don't even know what the check was. We don't even know what the fix was. This closed source software, and it's happening, this development is happening on a black box. And these are 5 players that are relaying all of our blocks or 90% of our blocks. and 10 players maximum that are building these blocks. I think what we need to do is to decide that this is a priority, that we should not have in Ethereum a trusted player making these decisions with a closed source software being the one that is responsible for paying or not, for refunding validators, for even deciding which transactions are censored or not. Once we make this a priority, then we can discuss whether or not there are viable designs for EPBS. Certainly, we're not going to be discussing this in a meeting like today. I maintain that we have a viable solution for EPBS that could be implemented in less than a year's time. And I am willing to defend this in an actual meeting with the community. And this thing should not be discussed in small meetings where EF research has some point of view, some biased point of view for EF research. Some other client devs like we are on Prism have another biases, and we're focusing on different kinds of design. We should have something like the interop that is going to happen soon in May, and we can come up with a design there, decide whether or not the current design works or not. But this, what I'm asking is for this to be prioritized. And if it's the scope of this fork is kept for 2024, then this cannot be included. But if the scope of this fork or the next one is maintained for 2025, then I would ask that we use the time to discuss this thing seriously and to allot the time for the interop in May and come up with a compromise to ship this by 2025.
Thank you. I have a quick question. Can you explain in a theoretically good EPBS sound EPBS design what would have gone differently in this incident?
Yes, so
visible in
there
this
are many,
incident?
there are minor things that are actually different, but some of them are the following. So the blocks would not have been missed. The blocks would have been empty. The consensus part of the block would have been included. Inclusion lists in those consensus part would have been included and enforced in the next blocks, no matter how many payloads were missing in the middle. Payment would have been immediate and conditional and for any amount and not trusted by the relay. And finally, the payloads themselves would have been signed. So I would have gotten, my validator would have gotten a signed payload. Yeah, exactly. Okay. The payload itself would have been signed by an entity that is in protocol. And validators can actually now, they themselves decide whether or not they have a way to ban them, or, I mean, each client could then decide if I'm going to ban those builders or not, instead of,
or at least like how to interact with them on an economic level.
Right. I mean, as long as someone that is building the block signs it, then that entity is responsible for the block. Currently, the validator itself is responsible for something that is not producing. So even if the builder decides to go with a relay, instead of opening itself an HTTP point so that validators ask for the builder directly for the header, even if post-EPBS, the builder decides to use a relay, the relay, whomever is building the block will be signing them, and we can ban them. We can react to them, which is not something that the validators were allowed to do in this event.
Sure. Just real quick, Stokes does note that, as we previously discussed, you could potentially map some of this transparency into a gossip channel because of the way signatures work today. Just
correct, and we can continue adding patches.
Yeah,
we can continue adding small patches and small patches and small patches instead of actually dealing with the issue, which is relays are trusted players. Let's make them trustless.
Thank you. So we got a few hands up. Terrence.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to add on top to that, right? So today, EPBS is one solution to the problem, but the fundamental problem is that, like today, the builder API is not like, it's basically not like incentive aligned with the rest of the protocol, right? Because you have literally 90% of the block that's relaying outside of the protocol, but the protocol does not have enforcement on that, right? And there are two factors, right? The first factor it's basically cost, right? Because Relay are spending tons of money a year. They're doing this work, but they have no way to monetize it. And the second factor is also the schedule, right? For example, how often when the client release already, and then we look at each other, and then we're like, well, we still have to wait for Matt Boost, we still have to wait for Matt Boost Relay. So it definitely adds a lot more complexity to basically it adds a lot more complexity to the process of the protocol. And then yeah, so basically I think we need to do something here.
Got it. Sean.
Yeah, so I think the idea of separating the consensus information from like the MEV incentives it generally makes sense. Specifically though, like I feel like a lot of the problems could be solved without as extreme a solution as bringing builders in protocol. It's like maybe that is good, maybe there's the end state, but like for example, guaranteed validator payments, like could you do that via using inclusion lists? Like in the current inclusion list designs, you just like require the builder to also include with their bid an inclusion list transaction that has the payment. Then the other thing people have been mentioning is like just gossiping bids, I think would be valuable, and we could pretty easily implement some sort of tracking with like builder signatures, builder public keys. But that's it. That's it from me.
Okay.
Sorry, did you say me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear. Yeah, so I think so I'm not against EPBS, but overall, I think like realistically, all EPBS constructions are going to be quite major protocol changes. So the potential tech that we're getting from these, if we don't implement a good solution, if we find out later that it has major flaws or we come up with a much better one, is actually way, way bigger than fixing a few things around MEFUs, which doesn't actually involve like core protocol changes at all. So I think I would be very careful. Like I think like my feeling is that we are not there at the moment. Specifically with the constructions that I know of that have major flaws in terms of not properly protecting builders from being exploited in like balancing attacks and things like that. This is actually a huge concern I have about them. And I think like before those are fixed, I feel like it's not really worth implementing them. Because to me, the trust, like relays have two kinds of trust. They have the trust by the validators who have to trust the relays. And I think that is minor because again, like we can easily like blacklist them if like a relay misbehaves. And like for example, if said relay, I don't know, well, whoever it was, like didn't pay out those validators, then I think lots of validators would now say, well, I mean, that sounds terrible. I'm not going to use them anymore. So this is a minor part of the trust. The much bigger trust problem is that relays can exploit builders by like analyzing their strategies, stealing their MEV, and so on. Like if we allow validators to exploit builders, then that part is actually not solved at all. And we will actually continue having relays because builders will still want that because they can otherwise be exploited and are not willing to include their high MEV transactions. And so then in the end, we haven't fixed anything at all. We will still have the relays and we will still have that problem.
Photos.
Yeah, so I think I know which attack Dan Rep is referring to, which is something that is not guaranteed on by the BTC sort of like designs. Yeah, I'm not willing to enter into like a technical discussion of what is a good design of EPBS or what's not. But I do want to say that I would argue against this being a large protocol change. If you look at every design that we have, they all will have the same set of ingredients. So this is not going to change whether or not you go with BTC or another attestation. All of them more or less rely on the same sort of like 2 slots approach, 2 reveals, two rounds of voting, so two rounds of attestations one way or another. So they're all more or less the same. And we are already discussing that there were serious proposals of having inclusion lists and max EB for the current fork, even scoped for 2024. And those are the largest changes from the point of view of the CL side. It's
The
true that
multi-slot
EPBS
component, you don't think is like a huge engineering change?
No, so no, actually not. I'm not from the CL side. Payload validation changes a lot because of the inclusion list, but this is already part of inclusion list. The part that the changes that are actually on for choice for the CL on the implementation side are the minor parts. I am actually already implementing for Prism the one design of EPBS, and EPBS alone is much simpler than the rest. So adding max EB is the most costly one, which is the one that I'm delaying for the end of the implementation.
Okay, so my intuition here is like getting into timing and fundamental data structures of having kind of this two-part data structure would be a massive engineering change, but you say otherwise. That is
no adding extra. So adding changes that are on board choice are typically not that complicated to implement. Changes on processing are the things that are most complicated to implement. It's true that it's not a light change, and it's not something that is going to happen this year, certainly. But I claim that the biggest part of the complexity of implementing EPBS comes from max EB changes and inclusion lists. I mean, if we go with a bonded in protocol builder, which is state.
Okay, so there has been a lot of design and research and discussion over the past more than 2 years on this, and you have something of a spec that you're working off of and a prototype to demonstrates a level of complexity. There are whenever I see this open up, there's a lot of questions as to like, what are we even optimizing? What is the right end goal of this? And it seems like there's a lot of varying opinions on that. And so the decision to include this first becomes the decision to figure out, what is the design? And I guess, are you making the case that over the next few months, figuring out if and what a consensus design is on here should be prioritized, or are you making the case that
so my case has been always the same on these meetings in the last few weeks, that I think we should prioritize in deciding what's the scope for the current fork is. If the scope for the current fork is 2024, then I don't argue anything, and I'll argue against any big change, and I'll hope that we plan something on the interop in May for 2025. If the scope is 2025, then I would argue that we need to consider EPBS for the next fork. And either way, I would want to have, by the time of the interop, some designs so that we go there and we fix one particular design during the
right. And there's another, and that's what I'm going to argue is, if there is a sense of either urgency or a sense of the ability to actually hone in on design at this point, regardless of the Electra conversations that happen over the next however many weeks, there can be kind of a parallel thread that attempts to hone in on this design with maybe some breakout calls and hone in on this design as we meet in person in May. I don't think that we can, and so that's my big question is like, are we at that point? I believe you believe we're at that point that we can have like a very productive 3 months to kind of hone in on this. Is that the general feeling, or is the feeling that there are many people from, or at least a couple people from various teams are willing to be a part of that conversation to hone in on design? Is the next logical step to have a breakout call about this, to at least begin to answer the question of whether people are willing to be putting a lot of effort into this, or even moderate and consistent effort over the next many months. Okay, I see some thumbs up. I see some comments. It seems like at least we'll have 5 people on the breakout call. Okay, Tim, do we usually schedule breakout call times on the call, or do we circulate something async?
Let's try to do it. Let's try to do it in the chat.
Okay.
14 UTC is usually a good time, but yeah.
Indeed, ETH o'clock.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Let's bounce some times around in the chat, see if that we can get on call. You know, again, R&D call that's trying to bring together the threads, or at least bring together the attempt to bring together the threads. Very cool. Thank you, Petras. Thank you, everyone, for that discussion. Let's move on to the next thing. So I'll just, to be frank, my read after the call 2 weeks ago was inclusionless. The general consensus was to table. My read on that was challenged by a number of folks and said no, there's still discussion to be had, and not just from the authors of inclusionless, but from a number of folks. So it is back on the agenda, and Mike has had some, I think, very, very illuminating, especially the spec change overview, to help us understand the complexity. Mike, do you want to reintroduce this topic?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Danny. I guess I'll post 2 links in the chat. The first is this unconditional ETH research, unconditional inclusionless post on ETH research, and then the second is the one Danny mentioned, which is this spec overview. And yeah, I guess the second doc, the first doc is kind of going through this new design and kind of discussing the relationship with the free DA post, and kind of like bringing back some of these designs that we've been hashing. I think actually we're kind of converging on something that we're all happy with, and so I started kind of just taking a look at the spec, which is that second doc. In general, it seems to me like the goal of that doc was, rather than trying to like iron out each of the kind of individual points fully, more to kind of scope what the changes in the spec would look like, which parts of the spec it would touch. So both on the consensus layer side and the state transition function for the execution layer, and in the engine API, just kind of defining the interface between the two. So yeah, I guess thanks to all the members, most of them in this call, who helped kind of scope that out and review those PRs. But yeah, I think in general, trying to convey the message that it doesn't have to be a massive change, and that it could be really beneficial to include it in Electra, just from both the timing perspective of like that censorship could change dramatically over the next months and weeks. There's one neutral builder that we depend on to include, a certain subset of transactions, and that could change very quickly. And also just getting some version of censorship resistance in prod, and like starting to collect data on its usage. And I think of censorship resistance as like this defense in depth thing, where this might not be the end game, but like some of these farther out research ideas like multiplicity, and they could all kind of synergize well with inclusionless. And yeah, I guess in general it feels worth trying something, rather than letting it go longer with the current censorship that we're seeing on mainnet now. So yeah, I guess that's the pitch. That's the reason I wanted to get the spec doc out there. I think have talked to a number of different client teams, both on the execution and consensus side, just to kind of get their take. And generally people seem keen to learn more and happy to engage. So not sure exactly. I think maybe like a breakout call for inclusionless specifically could also make sense. Xiaowei recommended that. So if that feels like a reasonable next step, we could bundle it with the EPBS talk. I mean, I definitely think there's a lot of overlap in terms of the themes that'll be discussed there. But I also think having its own talk could be useful potentially. So Thanks for the time. I think I'll leave it there unless there's any urgent questions, I guess.
Yeah, has anyone been able to look at Mike's spec change overview and want to weigh in on complexity, perceived complexity? Okay. Is there an appetite to get on a call with Mike and others that have been doing R&D on inclusion lists to dig a bit deeper sometime in the next 10 days? Photos.
So this design is essentially exactly the same as what's already included in our EPBS proposal. And I definitely want this in, but as I said before, if we're gonna scope this for this year, I think it's impossible. I think a big chunk of the complexity of EPBS is included in this and in MaxEB.
You keep saying MaxEB in relation to EPBS. Is MaxEB a dependency for EPBS?
Well, not for EPBS. The same thing for inclusion lists. Inclusion lists shouldn't be a dependency of EPBS, but both of them are pretty much a requirement for my kind of EPBS.
Right. I did take a look at the spec change overview and was moderately convinced that it's actually not a super complex change. But you believe that it is a large portion of the EPBS complexity already? Like you would say it's 50% of the EPBS complexity or 35%?
No, not yet. I think for EPBS, MaxEB is the thing that scares me the most.
I also checked out Mike's spec and I did think it looks simpler than I was expecting. So I definitely think it's feasible to include an Electra. I still think MaxEB seems like a more important change to me, just because like at some point the size of the validator set like is going to be an issue and the migration itself could take a while. But yeah, I think right now I would lean towards trying to include both MaxEB and inclusion lists and not do full EPBS. But yeah, it's just personal vibe right now. I don't know if that's too much, but.
And what's your perspective on, since we're here, PeerDAS and where that might or may not fit into what we want to do here?
Well, so like I think the PeerDAS changes are like, since they aren't hard fork dependent, like I'm not thinking about them as much like like to me it seems like they can be worked on in parallel to like a greater degree than some of these other things. But it's I mean for us it's like I would say that's been the highest priority change and it's got the most progress on it already. So yeah.
Okay, back to the question. Is there a desire to have an inclusionless breakout? Is there a desire to have it as 15 minutes of the breakout that's scheduled for EPBS? How do people want to approach discussing this further, or at least wrapping their heads around the complexity and making informed decisions from here? If there was a separate one, would people attend? Seems like Francesco, Terrence, Mike, others would attend. Okay, well, a few people will be there. let us discuss in the chat. Ahmad, are we agreeing on other EIPs for inclusion and Pectra in this call? We're continuing to talk about some of these big ticket items that have a difficult trade-off space in terms of when to add them, if to add them, when to prioritize them, and competing complexity and priorities. So yes, I don't know if we're going to agree, but we're going to continue to talk. So the next thing is on the list is PeerDAS. This like I'll echo my opinion on one of the authors here. I think it's, at least from my interpretation, a number of teams intend to put networking resources on this. It has a good degree of high parallelizability and doesn't necessarily have to be shipped, you know, with the same type of fork. The shipping PeerDAS without a hard fork means that there's no gas change, but that is a potential strategy to do here. Also, shipping PeerDAS with a tiny fork to change the gas, the data gas limit, is also kind of a feasible path. And so I do personally think that like it can continue to be on kind of an independent R&D rail that is highly parallelized. And I guess that's, at least for a few teams, seemingly the intention, because that's just what's happening. Does anyone want to make the case for not only having it on an independent R&D rail to be shipped when it's ready, but to also make the case for having it stated and intended to actually go out with Electra at this point? Or is that just not where people stand on this? Again, does anyone want to make the case to say PeerDAS should be stated and intended and put into the list for Electra, or should it just remain as a high priority parallelized rail? The default is the latter. Speak now if you believe the former.
So I just sort of think that if we pursue some of the bigger ticket items in Electra, and I think it's possible that since PeerDAS is just CL and would require like smaller changes for a hard fork, then maybe it might even come sooner. So I think at least Electra is kind of my point of view.
My other strategy here is that, you know, you could say tentative inclusion for Electra, but it's because it's super CL dependent and because it's doesn't touch state transition, it's also something that could be ripped out. Meaning if it were to be the blocker, it's easy for it to not be the blocker on getting a mainnet. Any other opinions people want to surface on how to handle this? Okay, I would say very much agreement on high priority parallel item, but that we can have these breakout calls and continue to discuss a couple of these other things that may or may not go in before PeerDAS surfaces anywhere in relation to Electra, but that we can, regardless, it's something that people are and will and be working on, but that we can pop this up in a couple of weeks and contextualize it after the breakout calls. Reasonable? Okay, and then another fun one. Maxi B, where do people stand in relation to that? Is there further discussion that can be had today, or does it need to also be contextualized by what comes out of some of the discussions that are going to happen outside of this call in the next couple of weeks? Any status update here? Any further thoughts? Okay, so this will come up in a conversation again in 2 weeks, and potentially there will be the ability to contextualize or foil against some of the other things that have been thought about in that interim. Okay. Other things people want to talk about in relation to Electra today? Other discussion points for today? Anything related to research, specification, or just general open discussion? Am I live? Can anyone hear me?
You're live.
Thank you. Okay, I appreciate it. These are tough conversations to have. There's a lot of really important work to do, a lot of great research and specifications to dig through. So thank you for bearing with me and working through it all. And we'll pick it up again in 2 weeks. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
See you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Danny.
Thanks, bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, bye.